you'll notice that when I carved out my geometry, the floor didn't get carved. Now, the reason the floor wasn't carved is because the floor itself is actually a 3D model that's been imported in. If I was to click on it, I can see that it is actually a static mesh actor. So even though this is a simple mesh, it will still work to illustrate the point. I'm going to click on this little magnifying glass next to static mesh, and that's automatically going to take my content browser down the bottom to the asset. I'm then going to double click on it, and I can see, for anyone that missed what I just did, I grabbed on this and I docked it with the top so that it would be part of my main window. You can see that the 3D object is just this. Now, any good looking mesh in the game is going to be a 3D object that's been imported in. You don't really carve things out that are like fine geometry using the geometry tools. So I'm going to give you an example of how that works. But first up, what I want to do is I'm going to click on this button here, which says Show or Hide Sources panel. It's on the left-hand side of your content browser. And that's going to give me the full proper content browser view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Content, ArcViz, Mesh, and I can see within this mesh folder we have a bunch of different static meshes. So I'm going to open up this couch. Now first up we have this couch. Now this couch represents a 3D object that's been imported into the game. If I was to click on wireframe mode, you can see that it is very, very dense with a whole bunch of different polygons that have been cut in to get a very nice shape. This isn't the kind of thing that you would make with your standard geometry toolset. I can click collision, and I can see that the couch has some very basic collision. It's got a standard box collision around it, and then it's also got this much tighter collision that is the complex collision. They're differentiated by the colors, and they're used for different purposes. I'll go into them later though. Now over here we have the materials that are being applied to the couch, and if I was to go to this and click the isolate button, highlight button, it's going to show you where that material is being used. This one is being used on the couch surface itself, but you'll notice that there are two materials, and the reason for that is the legs. If I was to click highlight on the legs, you'll notice that this material here is being set to these. So I can hear some of you asking, what is a material? And the best way for me to describe that is actually with a different asset. I'm going to close down my couch, and I'm going to open up this asset called Mug. Now when I do so, you'll see that we're greeted with a rather conventional 3D mug. Now the reason I wanted you to look at this is, first off, if I was to get this asset's material, up on the top right it says m_mug, and I was to click this magnifying glass, it would open it in my content browser. So I'm going to go back to here, and in my content browser I can see that m_mug has been selected. Now I'm going to double click on that, and what we're greeted with is this, which is our first material. Now, essentially a material is a shader. So a material is what you use to wrap textures around a 3D object. If you imagine any object that you get, remember that when you color it, it essentially has to be colored using a texture of some sort, so a two-dimensional image. So you have to wrap this two-dimensional image around a three-dimensional image, and we use shaders to do that. And not only are they used to apply the textures themselves, but they're also used to then add other settings. Now a good example in this case is if I zoom in here, we can see that we have our Epic Games mug. Now if I was to get this, I can see that over here we have a logo for Epic Games, which is interacting with some other nodes and eventually runs into this base color. Now I'm not going to go into the material editor too much here, but I will show you some of the changes that I'm referring to. If I click on mug color, so if I was to change this to, let's just say as an example, a orange, and I was to set this alpha value to 1, we're now going to get a mug that looks like this. So this is the way that you can create one 3D asset and one simple texture, but use various parameters to change how things look. Now, I'm very briefly going to go into what we're seeing here, but I'm going to cover this more in depth at another stage. Essentially what we have here is a texture sample that if I was to right click on and hit start previewing, the editor will now show me what it looks like just with this node being calculated. And you can see that it is white with an Epic Games logo. Now, this texture, if I was to open it within Unreal, looks like this. I'm sure you can see that something's missing. And the reason is that colors in Unreal, or textures, aren't stored as just red, green, and blue like they would be in a conventional image of something. They also store what's called an alpha layer, which is actually typically used to store the opacity of something, so how transparent it is. If I get rid of the opacity layer, you can now see that the logo is here. Now what this means is that if I was to just look at the alpha channel, I would get this. And what this essentially is a nice outline of where the logo is meant to go. Now I'm going to go back to the material, and you can see here that we have red, green, blue, and then there's this little gray one down the bottom. Now what this means is that on a texture sample, the white pin represents red, green, and blue. The gray pin represents the alpha channel. Essentially what it's saying here is the alpha layer runs into what's called a lerp, or a linear interpolation. And all this does is whenever something is black in the texture that goes into the alpha, make it this thing. Whenever something is white, make it this thing, which essentially combines the colors together to create this. Finally, to get the rest of the look, all that they've done is added some extra parameters to set up a normal map, which is used to create subtle bumps around the surface of the object, or in this case, to round out the object. This is something we're not going to be covering in this tutorial. They're also adding in a texture to calculate the ambient occlusion so that it has some just slight darknesses in the model where these vertices come together, just to create a slightly more realistic effect. Now this, again, isn't stuff that we're really going to cover too much in this initial presentation, but we will cover later. So I'm going to close down my mug asset. I'm not going to save my changes because I'd rather keep the mugs black for the time being. And I think it's about time for us to start looking at creating our first map.